The moment Roy Mercer walked through the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, on that scorching August evening in 1882, every man at the Long Pine Bar went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with him. They were watching him because he had just ridden in from the Kishome Trail Roundup at the Rocking H Ranch, and they all knew it, and they all had something burning behind their eyes that Roy could not yet name. Webb Danforth, who had a sun-cracked face like old saddle leather and a habit of speaking before thinking, was the first one to open his mouth. "You rode in with the Rocking H crew, didn't you, Mercer?" Webb said, and there was something slick and wrong in his voice, like a man testing the ice before he puts his full weight on it. Roy set his hat on the bar and looked at Webb steadily. "I did. 3 weeks on the trail. What of it? Then you were out at the Rocking H when Grace Talmadge was there." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went everywhere at once. Half a dozen men shifted on their bar stools. A card game at the corner table went suddenly silent. Someone set down a glass too hard. Roy looked at Webb without blinking. "I was at the Rocking H Roundup, that's what I just said." And Webb pressed, leaning in, and now the other men were leaning in too, their faces hungry with the particular hunger of men who already believe they know a story and only want confirmation. "And nothing," Roy said flatly. The silence that followed was not the silence of satisfaction. It was the silence of something deeply confused, because every man in that bar had a story about Grace Talmadge. Jim Prescott claimed she had kissed him behind the water trough on the second night of the roundup. Old Cal Bridges swore she had made eyes at him from across the cookfire every single evening, and that she had whispered something in his ear that he refused to repeat in polite company. Tom Vickers said she had slipped a note under his bedroll. Hank Delaney, who was known to be the most honest man in Sumner County, claimed Grace Talmadge had told him directly that she was desperately lonely and looking for a man with real prospects. Every man at that roundup had a story about Grace Talmadge. Except the one man who had actually been there to see her clearly, to see all of it, the truth of her and the truth of them, the man who had watched the whole sorry theater play out from beginning to end. Except Roy Mercer. And that silence, that one man's refusal to confirm, to embellish, to participate in the mythology being built around a woman he had come to understand in ways none of them ever would, that silence was about to change everything. It had begun 3 weeks earlier, on the first morning of the Rocking H Roundup, in the pre-dawn dark before the sun had burned the dew off the short grass prairie. Roy Mercer had come down from Abilene on a hired hand's wages, having spent the last 2 years building a quiet reputation as a man who could read cattle, read weather, and read people with equal reliability. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a patience that the other cowboys often mistook for aloofness. He did not drink to excess. He did not brag. He did not start fights, though he had finished a few when the situation demanded it. The foreman of the Rocking H, a thick-necked Texan named Burl Hutchins, had hired him specifically because of that reputation. "I need a man who can count heads without losing his own," Burl had said when he hired Roy in Abilene 3 months prior. "The roundup gets rowdy. Lots of different outfit crews converging. I need somebody steady." Roy had not known, when he accepted that job, that steady was exactly what Grace Talmadge needed too. The Rocking H Ranch spread across several thousand acres of rolling Kansas grassland south of Caldwell, owned by a man named Edmund Talmadge who had come out from Ohio in the early 1870s and built himself a legitimate cattle empire through equal parts hard work, smart land acquisition, and a willingness to fight lawyers as hard as he fought droughts. Edmund Talmadge was 61 years old in the summer of 1882, and he had one daughter, Grace, who was 25. And Grace was the reason the roundup had become something considerably more complicated than a cattle count. Edmund Talmadge was dying. That was not common knowledge among the hired crews, but Roy figured it out on the second day when he saw the old man come out to oversee the branding and noticed how carefully he walked, how he gripped the fence rail not to lean casually but to hold himself upright, how his face had the yellowish cast of a man whose liver was failing him. Roy said nothing. It was not his business to say anything, but he watched, because watching was what Roy Mercer did. Grace Talmadge arrived at the main ranch house on the third morning of the Roundup, having traveled by stage from Wichita, where she had been staying with her father's sister for the past several months. Roy first saw her crossing the yard toward the house, carrying a traveling bag that was too heavy for her and refusing help from the young wrangler who offered it, not out of rudeness, but out of a kind of fierce self-sufficiency that was immediately and entirely legible to someone paying attention. She was not a fragile woman. That was the first thing Roy understood about Grace Talmadge. She was of medium height, with dark brown hair that the prairie wind was already pulling loose from its pins, and she had the kind of face that rewarded a second look far more than a first, not conventionally pretty in the way of fashion plates, but alive with intelligence and a directness that most men found disconcerting. Her eyes were dark gray, almost the color of storm clouds just before rain, and they missed nothing. Roy watched her go into the house. He went back to his work. The story started that same day. He did not know it until later, did not understand the mechanism by which a woman's mere arrival on her own family's property could become the occasion for an entire carnival of male invention. But by the evening of the third day, when the hired hands gathered around the cookfire after supper, he heard the first one. It was Jim Prescott, a lanky cowboy from a neighboring outfit called the Double Bar, who started it. Prescott had caught a glimpse of Grace crossing the yard that morning, and that single glimpse had apparently been sufficient to launch a full-scale fabrication. "She looked right at me," Prescott said to the men around the fire, with the careful casualness of a man deploying a significant claim. "Right directly at me," smiled. Roy, who had been at the fence on the other side of the yard and had an unobstructed view of the entire scene, knew that Grace Talmadge had not looked at Jim Prescott at all. She had been looking toward the barn, distracted, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely. He said nothing. That was the first story. Others followed with remarkable speed. Old Cal Bridges, who was 46 and had a wife and 3 grown children in Dodge City, announced over breakfast the next morning that Miss Talmadge had waved to him from the porch. Tom Vickers claimed she had asked him to pass along a message to someone, though the content of the message changed every time he told it. Hank Delaney, to his credit, only claimed he had exchanged a polite good morning with her, which Roy thought might actually be true, though he doubted the deeper interpretation Hank put on it, which was that she had lingered longer than necessary and seemed reluctant to move on. Roy began to understand something about those men and their stories. None of them were bad men precisely. Prescott was thoughtless but not cruel. Cal Bridges was just lonely in the way that men on the trail got lonely, hungry for something beyond cattle and dust, and the same dozen faces. Tom Vickers was young, not yet 22, and had very little experience with women and enormous anxiety about that fact. Hank Delaney genuinely believed his own interpretations, because Hank Delaney was the kind of man who arranged the facts of the world to support whatever story he needed to tell himself that week. But the cumulative effect of those stories was something Roy found deeply troubling, even before he understood the full situation, because Grace Talmadge was not the woman those stories described. And Roy was starting to know that, starting to see who she actually was, in the small true moments that the storytellers missed because they were too busy constructing their narratives to actually look. He first spoke to her on the 4th day of the Roundup. It happened by accident, which was the way the most significant things in Roy Mercer's life had always happened. He had gone to the main barn to check on a roan mare that had been favoring her left foreleg, and Grace was already there, crouched in the straw beside the horse, running her fingers carefully along the leg from fetlock to knee with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Roy stopped in the doorway. He watched her work for a moment without speaking, not wanting to startle either her or the horse, "Superficial strain," she said without looking up. "She'll be fine with rest, but whoever's been working her on the rocky ground near the south pasture needs to be told to stop." "I'll pass that along," Roy said. She looked up then. There was no coyness in it, no performance. She simply assessed him with those gray eyes the same way she had just assessed the horse, with direct and uncomplicated attention. "You're not one of my father's regular hands," she said. "Hired on for the Roundup. Roy Mercer out of Abilene. Grace Talmadge." She stood brushing straw from her skirt. "Do you actually know who to tell about the horse, or were you being polite? Burl Hutchins, your foreman, I'll tell him this evening. Tell him before noon she should not be out in the afternoon heat on that leg." "Yes, ma'am," Roy said. He turned to go. She said, "You're the quiet one." He paused. "Beg pardon." "The men talk," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness and not quite amusement, but was a complicated mixture of both. "Even in the house, you can hear them around the evening fire, all of them talking, but there's always one voice I don't hear. I assumed it must be someone who had left the camp, but you're still here." "I talk when I have something to say," Roy said. She looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, something very small and very careful, like a door that had been locked for a long time moving on its hinges just slightly. "That's a rarer quality than you might think," she said, and turned back to the horse. "Roy went and told Burl Hutchins about the mare before noon." He thought about the conversation for the rest of the day, which was unusual for him, because Roy Mercer was not a man who replayed conversations. He was a man who paid attention in the moment and then moved forward. But there was something about Grace Talmadge, about the particular quality of her attention and her directness, that stayed with him the way a song sometimes stays when you have only heard it once. He learned more about her situation gradually, the way you learn about terrain by moving through it rather than looking at a map. Edmund Talmadge was dying of cirrhosis. That much became confirmed when Roy overheard a quiet conversation between Edmund and his ranch attorney, a silver-haired man named Aldous Crane, who had ridden out from Caldwell specifically to update the paperwork on the estate. Edmund had perhaps 6 months, perhaps less. The ranch would pass to Grace, but the ranch had debts, substantial ones, accumulated during the drought years of the late 1870s, and there were complications with the land titles that Crane described in careful legal language that translated, in plain speech, to the following problem. Grace would need either significant capital or a husband with significant capital to hold the rocking H together against the men who were already circling. And the men who were circling were not just the moneylenders and the land lawyers. There were men at this very Roundup who were not just building romantic myths about Grace Talmadge. Some of them were building financial ones. Roy put this together over several days of careful listening, the way you assemble a picture from the pieces that other people let fall without noticing. Vernon Stroud was the one he worried about most. Stroud was not one of the hired hands. He was the owner of the neighboring Stroud Cattle Company, a man of about 50 with a wide, red face and small, quick eyes that were the color of dirty water. He had come to the Roundup as a guest of Burl Hutchins, ostensibly to discuss the shared grazing rights along the creek boundary between the two properties. But Roy had watched Stroud watch Grace Talmadge for 2 days before he said a single word to the man, and what he saw in Stroud's watching had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with acquisition. On the 5th evening, Roy deliberately positioned himself near the water trough after supper, where Stroud had taken to spending time with 2 of his own men, Cleet Moody and a flat-faced enforcer named Dill, and he listened to what they talked about when they thought no one was near. What he heard made something cold and hard settle into his chest. Stroud was not interested in Grace Talmadge as a woman. He was interested in the rocking H. And his plan, expressed in the quiet, confident voice of a man who does not expect to be stopped, was to use the estate's debt situation to force a sale. He had already spoken to the moneylenders in Wichita. He had already, apparently, had conversations with Aldous Crane, the very attorney who was supposed to be protecting Edmund Talmadge's interests. Conversations that had resulted in an arrangement Roy could only describe, even in the privacy of his own thoughts, as a betrayal of the highest order. Grace did not know any of this. Roy spent a sleepless night deciding what to do with what he knew. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's business without invitation. He had been hired to count cattle and manage the Roundup logistics, not to get himself between a powerful landowner and a dying man's estate. He had no standing in the matter. He had no legal authority. He had no particular claim on Grace Talmadge's situation. But he had information she needed, and withholding it made him complicit in a dark scheme that was going to cost a woman everything she had. He found Grace the next morning at the same place they had first spoken, at the barn, where she had made a habit of checking on the roan mare's recovery before the day's work began. "I need to speak with you about something," he said. "Something serious." She looked at him with those gray eyes that held their measurement steady and level. "Then speak." He told her everything he had heard. He was careful to present it as exactly what it was, what he had overheard, not conclusions he had drawn beyond what the words supported, not dramatic embellishment. He told it straight and plain, and he watched her face as he told it. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She stood very still, with one hand resting on the mare's neck, and her expression moved through several things in sequence. The rapid passage of shock giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked like the grim satisfaction of a person who had suspected something terrible and now had it confirmed. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Crane," she said. "I wondered about Crane. He has been discouraging me from reviewing the debt documentation directly. He keeps saying it is too complicated, that I should trust his summary." "That's worth noting," Roy said. "It is considerably more than worth noting," Grace said, with a quiet heat that was nothing like hysteria and everything like controlled fury. "It means my father is being robbed by his own attorney while he is too ill to defend himself, and that Vernon Stroud has been planning this for how long, exactly? From what I heard, at least since last winter, he has been positioning himself to make an offer that Crane will present to your father's estate as the best available option." Grace turned from the horse and faced Roy directly, and her expression had the clarity of a woman who had just made a decision that she intended to see through regardless of the cost. "Why are you telling me this?" asked. "You have no stake in it. You are a hired hand who will be gone in 2 weeks. You could have said nothing, collected your wages, and ridden back to Abilene." Roy considered how to answer that, because it was a fair question and it deserved a fair answer. "Because it was right to tell you," he said, "and because I do not like watching someone get robbed." She studied him for another moment. That measuring look that he was beginning to understand was not distrust but precision. She measured everyone. It was how she moved through a world that had given her ample reason to be cautious. "All right, Roy Mercer," she said finally. "Then I need your help." What followed was 5 days of the most intensive, focused work Roy had done in his life that had nothing to do with cattle. Grace, it turned out, was considerably more competent than anyone had given her credit for. She had grown up on this ranch. She knew the land, the books, the history of every parcel and every debt. The reason she had been in Wichita with her aunt was not, as the gossip in Caldwell had framed it, that she was being kept away from responsibility, but that her father, in his illness and his pride, had sent her away precisely so she would not have to watch him decline. Edmund Talmadge was the kind of man who protected the people he loved by hiding the hard things from them. Grace did not forgive him for it exactly, but she understood it, and she set aside her feelings about it with a practicality that Roy found remarkable, because practicality in the face of grief was one of the hardest things a person could sustain. They worked in the evenings, after the Roundup day was done, and the other men were at their cookfires building their stories. Grace would spread the financial documents on the kitchen table of the ranch house, and Roy would sit across from her, and they would go through them together. Roy had more facility with numbers than most cowboys, a product of 2 years spent as a bookkeeper's assistant in his early 20s before he discovered he was better suited to the outdoors. He could read a ledger with the same fluency he could read a grazing range. What they found in Edmund Talmadge's books was damning, but not in the way Crane had implied. The debts were real, but they were manageable. The land titles were complicated, but they were not fatally so. There were 2 liens against the northern pasture that could be resolved with a direct payment to the bank in Wichita, a payment that the ranch's current cattle operation could support if the upcoming sale was handled correctly. The picture that Crane had been painting for Edmund, the picture of an estate in terminal financial crisis that could only be resolved by a wholesale sale to a buyer like Stroud, was a fabricated darkness designed to make the inevitable look inevitable. "He has been lying to my father for months," Grace said on the 3rd evening of their review, her voice very quiet and very controlled. "He has been preparing the ground," Roy agreed. "Making sure the sale looks like the only option when Stroud makes his offer, which Stroud will make the moment my father passes." Grace closed the ledger and pressed her hands flat on the cover and stared at the middle distance. "My father does not know any of this. Do you want to tell him?" She was quiet for a long time. The lamp on the table between them threw its warm light over the documents, over the evidence of the betrayal, over the careful truth they had built together out of numbers and dates, and the paper record of a man's life work. "I have to tell him," she said finally. "He deserves to know that his ranch can survive him. He has been dying for months thinking he was leaving me a disaster. He deserves to know the truth." "That's going to require replacing Crane first," Roy said. "If Crane gets wind that you've reviewed these documents, he'll accelerate the timeline. Then we move first." She looked at Roy. "There is a lawyer in Caldwell, a man named Prescott, who is not connected to Stroud or to Crane. He handled some property work for my aunt several years ago. I trust him. Can you get a message to him before Crane knows what you're doing? I can ride to Caldwell myself tomorrow morning." Roy looked at her across the lamplit table. This woman who had arrived on her own property 4 days ago carrying a bag that was too heavy for her, and who had, in the space of 4 evenings, dismantled a secret conspiracy designed to steal her inheritance. And he felt something in his chest that was not just admiration, though it was certainly that. It was the feeling of recognizing someone, of seeing a person and understanding, with the immediate and undeniable clarity of genuine knowledge, that this was a person you had been waiting to find. He did not say any of this. It was far too early to say any of this, and the situation was too serious, and Roy Mercer was, above all things, a man who understood the appropriate timing of things. "I'll ride with you," he said instead. "Stroud has men on the property. I'd rather you not go alone." Grace looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read, somewhere between gratitude and something more private. "All right," she said, "before sunrise." They rode out the next morning in the gray light before dawn, keeping to the creek trail to avoid the main road, where Stroud's man Dill had taken to posting himself in the mornings for reasons he described as simply taking the air, but which Roy read as watching. They rode for the first mile in silence, which was a particular kind of silence, not empty but full, the way a room feels full when something important is present in it, even if no one is speaking about it. The prairie stretched around them in the early light, the short grass silver with dew, the sky to the east beginning to pale along its bottom edge. Grace rode well. That was something that struck Roy even in the midst of the practical urgency of what they were doing. She rode with the easy competence of someone who had spent her childhood on horseback, not performing skill but simply possessing it. "Tell me something about yourself," she said after they had ridden about 2 miles in that full silence. Roy considered. "What would you like to know?" "Anything true," she said, and the way she said it, with that slight emphasis on true, told him something about the past several days of her life and what it had cost her to discover that the people she should have been able to trust had been spinning fictions around her. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father had a small farm, Nothing like your father's operation. We grew corn and kept some hogs and barely stayed ahead of the weather every year. I left when I was 18 because I could see that the farm would not support both of us, my father and me, and because I had a restlessness in me that needed open ground. And the cattle work satisfied it. For a while. And then Abilene and the bookkeeping job, and then back to the trail. I have been trying to put together enough money to take a lease on some land of my own. Nothing ambitious, something I can manage alone. You intend to ranch alone. I intend to start alone, Roy said carefully, and he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He heard the very slight pause before she responded, and he noted it, filed it away. That seems a hard life, she said. Most good lives are hard, Roy said. She considered this as they rode and then said, yes, I suppose they are. They reached Caldwell by mid-morning. The attorney, a small, precise man named Edward Prescott, who had nothing to do with Jim Prescott the cowboy except the shared name, received them in his office above the dry goods store on the main street. He was initially skeptical, in the way that lawyers are professionally skeptical of urgent claims. But Grace spread the documents on his desk with the same methodical confidence she brought to everything, and Roy talked him through the numbers. And within an hour, Edward Prescott's skepticism had transformed into the focused energy of a man who recognized both the injustice and the legal opportunity in front of him. I can file a formal challenge to Crane's authority as a state representative by the end of the week, Prescott said. If your father is willing to sign a new power of attorney directing me to represent his interests, Crane is finished. Stroud's arrangement falls apart. My father will sign, Grace said. You are certain? My father is a proud man, Mr. Prescott. He is also an honest one. When he understands what Crane has done, he will not tolerate it for one moment, regardless of how ill he is. She was right about her father. They rode back to the Rocking H that afternoon, and that evening Grace sat with Edmund Talmadge in the parlor of the ranch house while Roy waited on the porch, and she told her father what she had found. Roy could not hear the words through the closed door, but he heard the silences between the words, and once, very briefly, he heard Edmund Talmadge's voice rise in a way that had nothing to do with anger at Grace, and everything to do with the particular raw fury of a man who has discovered that his trust was weaponized against him. An hour later, Grace came out onto the porch. She stood beside Roy and looked out at the darkening prairie, and her expression was composed in the careful way of someone who has spent emotional energy they cannot afford to spend but has no choice. He will sign the new documents tomorrow, she said. He wants to meet Edward Prescott personally. He says he will not give his signature to a man he cannot look in the eye. That sounds like your father, Roy said, though he had only met Edmund Talmadge briefly. It does, Grace agreed, and the two words carried the weight of a lifetime of knowing someone, of loving them and being exasperated by them and being shaped by them into who you are. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, he cried, my father. He told me he had been lying awake at night worrying that he was leaving me with nothing but a debt and a lost cause. He has been carrying that for months. She paused. He does not need to carry it anymore. Roy turned to look at her in the evening light. There were no tears on her face, but the effort of keeping them back was visible to him now, the slight tension in her jaw, the deliberate steadiness of her breathing. He did not make the mistake of telling her not to feel what she was feeling. He did not offer false comfort or immediate cheerfulness. He simply said, you gave him something tonight that no one else could have given him. That matters. She looked at him, and her eyes in the fading light were more gray than ever, complicated and deep. You gave it to me, she said. The information, the ability to act on it. Without you, I would not have known until it was too late. You would have found it eventually, he said. You're not a woman who misses things. Eventually might have been after my father was gone, she said. After the documents were signed and the ranch was sold and Stroud had what he wanted. Eventually is a word for people who have the luxury of time. Roy said nothing, because she was right. Roy, she said, and the use of his name, just his name without the formality of Mr. or the distance of hey you, hid him somewhere that he was trying with mixed success to keep defended. I want you to know that I see what kind of man you are. I have been watching you for a week, the same way you have been watching everything carefully without announcing it. And I see you. He held very still because something was changing in the air between them and he did not want to move wrong in it. What do you see? He asked. A man who does not want credit, she said, but who does the right thing regardless. A man who listens more than he speaks and who, when he speaks, means exactly what he says. A man who is trying to build something real. She paused. I see you, Roy Mercer, and I would like you to stay. The Roundup had 4 days left. What Roy Mercer agreed to was that he would not leave when it ended. Over those 4 days, something unfolded between them that was not sudden, because nothing real is ever truly sudden. But that felt as though it had been building toward exactly this moment from a direction neither of them could have anticipated. It was in the conversations they continued to have each evening, no longer about documents and legal strategies. Those battles were largely won, but about other things, about Missouri and Ohio, about the particular quality of prairie light at different hours, about what a person wants from a life, and how seldom the world makes it simple to want it. It was in the way they moved around each other during the day's work, not avoiding each other's company but not performing its importance either, simply being near each other in the way that two people are near each other when nearness has become the natural state of things. It was in the moment on the 7th evening when she brought him a cup of coffee out to the porch after supper and sat in the chair beside him rather than the one across from him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and neither of them acknowledged this, but neither of them moved. Vernon Stroud noticed. Stroud was not a stupid man, and he had been watching Grace Talmadge with the cold attention of an investor watching a market. When she stopped being visibly anxious and started carrying herself with a particular kind of quiet confidence, when the young cowboy from Abilene started spending evenings on the ranch house porch, when Grace rode into Caldwell and came back with a different expression, Stroud understood that something had shifted against him, and he decided to address it. He came to Roy the following morning, finding him at the corral where Roy was working with a young quarter horse that had been giving trouble. Sir, Stroud said, with the false bonhomie of a man who thinks money makes all his social approaches acceptable. Mind if we have a word? Roy kept working with the horse. Go ahead. Stroud leaned on the fence rail with the comfortable posture of a man who believes himself to be in a position of strength. You've been spending time with the Talmadge woman. I have been working the Talmadge Roundup, Roy said evenly. Don't be coy with me, son. I've been watching. You've been filling her head with ideas, I think. Roy stopped working with the horse. He turned and looked at Stroud directly, with the full weight of the attention that most men found more disconcerting than anger. What kind of ideas? He asked. Stroud's easy smile did not entirely hold under that look, but he pressed on. The girl is in a vulnerable position. Her father is dying. The estate is in trouble. She doesn't fully understand the complexity of the financial situation, and it would be a shame if someone were filling her with false hope about prospects that aren't real. Are you warning me away from her? Roy asked. His voice was perfectly calm. I'm suggesting, Stroud said carefully, that a man in your position, a hired hand with no land and no assets, should be careful about the commitments he implies. It would be cruel to encourage expectations in a young woman that you have no capacity to fulfill. The ranch needs real resources to survive, Mercer, not a cowboy's good intentions. Roy looked at Stroud for a long moment. I appreciate the concern, he said in a tone that made it very clear he did not. Is there anything else? Stroud's face reddened slightly. You're making a mistake here, son. I make my own mistakes, Roy said and turned back to the horse. Stroud left. Roy finished with the horse and then walked to the ranch house and knocked on the door and told Grace exactly what had just happened, because he had promised himself he would not keep things from her, and because she needed to know that Stroud was aware his plan was in jeopardy. Grace listened to him with that precise, level attention, and when he finished, she said, He is going to move against the attorney. He will try to delay the new power of attorney before my father can sign it. "That's what I think too," Roy said. "Prescott needs to be here tomorrow." Grace sent a writer to Caldwell within the hour. Edward Prescott arrived the next morning with his documents already prepared, having ridden through an uncomfortable night in the knowledge that urgency was urgency. He sat with Edmund Talmadge at the parlor table, and Grace stood beside her father, and Roy stood in the doorway at Edmund's request, because Edmund Talmadge had, in the past 2 days, developed a clear and considered opinion of Roy Mercer. Edmund had wanted to meet the man who had ridden to Caldwell with his daughter, and he had invited Roy to supper the evening before and spent 2 hours in quiet but thorough conversation with him. Edmund Talmadge asked questions the way Grace did, directly, without social padding, and he listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man who does not have time to waste on anything but the truth. At the end of supper, Edmund had said to Roy, with the particular frankness of a man who knows his time is limited, "You are not what I would have arranged for her if I had arranged anything. But I did not arrange anything, because Grace would not have tolerated it, and she would have been right not to. I think you know what I am saying to you, Mr. Mercer." "I think I do, sir," Roy had said. "Good," Edmund had said. "Then don't be slow about it." Edmund Talmadge signed the new power of attorney the next morning with a steady hand and an expression of considerable relief. The document dismissed Aldous Crane from any further role in the estate and directed all future legal and financial matters to Edward Prescott. It was witnessed and dated and notarized on the spot. When Crane arrived at the ranch that same afternoon, as he did every week with his practiced expressions of concern and his careful framing of hopelessness, he was met at the gate by Prescott, who informed him with precise legal courtesy that his services were no longer required, and that he should expect to hear from the Kansas Bar Association regarding a formal complaint that was being prepared against him. The color that drained from Aldous Crane's face in that moment was one of the more satisfying things Roy Mercer had witnessed in his adult life. Stroud, when he learned what had happened, made one final attempt. He arrived at the ranch the following day and requested a meeting with Grace, and she received him in the parlor with Roy present at her invitation and Prescott's documents spread on the table like a hand of cards already played. Stroud made his offer anyway, because men like Stroud make their offers because the making of them is a habit they cannot easily break. He presented the sale of the Rocking H as the generous act of a neighborly man offering a fair price for a property that was, in his framing, still in serious difficulty. Grace let him finish. She was entirely composed. She thanked him for his time. She told him that the Rocking H was not for sale, that its financial situation was stable and improving, and that she would be grateful if he directed any future communication to her attorney rather than to her directly. Then she showed him the door. After he left, she stood in the parlor for a moment, and then she put her face in her hands, not crying but taking a moment, a single sustained breath that acknowledged everything the past 2 weeks had required of her. Roy said nothing. He simply waited. When she lifted her face, her eyes were clear. There was something in them that had not been there before, not relief exactly, though it was certainly relief, but the particular quality of a person who has gone through something difficult and come out knowing themselves better for it. "My father is going to be all right," she said. "He has perhaps 6 months, maybe more, but he is going to spend those months knowing that what he built is going to survive him." "Because of you," Roy said. "Because of both of us," she said firmly, and looked at him with those gray eyes that held their level measurement steady, but now held something else as well, something warmer and more direct than measurement, something that he had been quietly certain of for days but had not allowed himself to assume. He crossed the room to her, not quickly but steadily, with the intentionality of a man who has decided something, and he took her hand in both of his, and she let him. And for a moment they simply stood in the parlor of her father's house, in the dusty Kansas light, in the wreckage of someone else's dark scheme, and understood that they had arrived at something. "I told you I intended to start alone," he said, keeping her eyes. That is no longer what I intend." "No," she said. "No. What I intend now is considerably more complicated and considerably better, and it involves you specifically if you are willing." She searched his face for a long moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile yet but was clearly preparing to become one. "Ask me properly, Roy Mercer," she said. "Not yet," he said, surprising her. He could see it. "Not while your father is dying and the estate is still being sorted and everything is still in motion. You deserve to be asked when things are settled, when you can hear it clearly without the noise of all the rest of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face was something that moved through surprise and arrived slowly at a tenderness so genuine that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "You are a very particular kind of man," she said. "I have been told that before," he said, "usually by people who meant it as a complaint." "I do not mean it as a complaint," she said. He kept hold of her hand for another moment. Then he let it go gently, because there was still work to be done, and because Roy Mercer understood that the right thing requires the right moment. The roundup ended 2 days later. The other men departed in their various directions, taking their stories with them. Jim Prescott rode back to the Double Bar Ranch with his account of the smile that had never happened. Old Cal Bridges returned to Dodge City with his tale of the wave from the porch. Tom Vickers and Hank Delaney and the rest of them scattered across the Kansas plain, carrying their myths of Grace Talmadge into the saloons and the bunkhouses and the campfire conversations of the trail season, where the myths would grow and shift with every retelling, as myths always do. And Roy Mercer stayed. He stayed because Edmund Talmadge had, in one of the practical gestures of a man who was both dying and pragmatic, offered him the position of ranch foreman, replacing Burl Hutchins, who had been complicit in Stroud's access to the property if not in the conspiracy itself, and who departed without argument when Edmund made clear that he knew about the arrangement. Roy accepted the position not because it solved any immediate problem for him, but because it was honest work he was qualified to do, and because it meant he did not have to leave. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work than the roundup, quieter, more sustained, more revealing of the actual texture of daily life on the rocking H. Roy threw himself into the foreman's job with the same focused competence he brought to everything, assessing the ranch's operational needs, managing the remaining hired hands with a directness they responded to better than they had responded to Hutchins's erratic authority, beginning the process of untangling the financial situation that Prescott was managing on the legal side. He and Grace worked alongside each other through those weeks in a way that was entirely practical and entirely something else at the same time. They had the ease of two people who have already been through something difficult together, who have already seen each other at the moments of clearest self-revelation, and who have not been disappointed. The pretense and performance that tend to govern the early stages of romantic feeling had been bypassed almost entirely by the circumstances of how they had found each other, and what remained was something more real and more durable and considerably more interesting. They argued sometimes because they were two people with strong views and the confidence to express them. They argued about the best grazing rotation for the South pasture. They argued about whether to sell the spring calves early at a predictable price or hold them into the fall for a better market. They argued about the temperament of a particular stallion that Roy thought needed more work before he was ready for stud and Grace thought was being underestimated. They argued with the full engagement of two people who respect each other's intelligence, which meant the arguments were productive, which meant they were, in their own way, a form of intimacy. Edmund Talmadge watched all of this from the increasing quietness of his illness, and he was, in those weeks, a man at considerable peace. He and Roy developed their own relationship in those weeks, separate from Grace's presence, the slow mutual recognition of two men who shared a fundamental seriousness about the world and who had arrived at it from very different directions. Edmund told Roy about coming out from Ohio in 1872, about the first winter on the land and the second that was nearly worse, about the choices he had made to build the ranch and the choices he had made that he was less proud of, because Edmund Talmadge was, as Grace had said, an honest man, and honest men do not sanitize their own histories. Roy told Edmund about Missouri and the trail and the years in between, told it with the same plain directness he brought to everything, and Edmund listened with the attention of a man who is making assessments that matter. "She has never in her life had someone look at her the way you do," Edmund said one evening in early October, when the prairie had gone gold and the air had the particular clarity of the Kansas fall. Roy was quiet for a moment because he was not sure how to respond to that without either false modesty or presumption. "I think she deserves to be looked at that way," he said finally. "She does," Edmund agreed. "And she is smart enough to know the difference between what's real and what isn't. She has been disappointed before, by men who weren't worth her time, and she learned from it, but she did not become hard from it. That is the thing about Grace. The world keeps trying to make her hard and she keeps refusing." Roy thought about the stories at the Silver Spur Saloon that had not yet happened but would happen, the myths that the Roundup men were already spreading, the casual architecture of invention that people were building around a woman they had never actually seen. "She is the least hard person I know," Roy said, "and also the strongest. I'm not sure how she manages that." "Character," Edmund said simply. "It's what character looks like." Edmund Talmadge died on a Thursday morning in late November, with Grace beside him and Roy just outside the door in the cold morning air. He went quietly, which Grace said was like him, because her father had always disliked causing disruption and would have found a loud or dramatic departure to be in poor taste. She grieved him honestly and completely, which meant she allowed herself to cry for 3 days and to be angry for 2 days and to be very quiet for a week. And Roy was present through all of it, not trying to fix or redirect or speed up what grief does, simply being steadily, reliably there. There was a service in Caldwell at the church her father had attended, and the town came out for it in the way that a town comes out for a man who had built something real on the land and treated people fairly. Grace spoke at the service, and what she said about her father was true and clear and without performance. And more than one person in that church looked at this young woman standing at the front of the room and revised whatever incomplete notion they had carried of her. After the service, Edward Prescott met with Grace privately to confirm the final status of the estate. The ranch was solvent. The liens on the northern pasture had been paid. The land titles were clear. The rocking H was Grace Talmadge's, free and unencumbered, exactly as her father had worked a lifetime to make it. Vernon Stroud, faced with the collapse of his arrangement and the looming legal complaint against Crane, had retreated to his own property, and from all evidence was conducting himself with somewhat more restraint than he had during the summer. Aldous Crane had resigned from practice in Caldwell and left the county. The threat was over. Grace came home from Prescott's office and found Roy in the barn, exactly where she had first found him speaking, working with the roan mare, who had long since recovered and was now one of his favored horses on the property. "She's ready for the spring circuit," Grace said, nodding at the mare. "She's ready for considerably more than that," Roy said. "She's one of the best-tempered horses I've worked with." Grace was quiet for a moment, standing in the barn with the December cold pressing at the boards and the lamp throwing its warm circle around them both. "Prescott says everything is clear," she said. "I know. He sent a note this morning." Another quiet moment. The mare shifted and settled. "You said not yet," Grace said. Her voice was very steady. "Back in October, you said not while everything was in motion. You said I deserved to hear it when things were settled." Roy set down the brush he had been using on the mare. He turned to face Grace fully, and his expression was the clearest she had ever seen it, with no reservation in it, no strategy, just the plain and honest face of a man who has made up his mind. "Things are settled," he said. "They are," she agreed. He came to her across the barn floor, and when he was close, he took both her hands in his the way he had done in October, and he said, "Grace Talmadge, I have been in love with you since the morning I walked into this barn and found you already taking care of what needed taking care of without waiting for anyone to help you. I want to marry you. I want to work this land beside you and build something real here, not as your foreman, not as someone passing through, but as your husband, your partner, the man who is here in the morning and still here at night and all the years after, if you will have me." Grace looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes that were, in this moment, the least armored he had ever seen them, entirely open, entirely present. "I told you weeks ago that I wanted you to stay," she said. "I have been wanting you to ask me this since October. Is that a yes?" "Yes, Roy Mercer," she said, with a smile that was nothing like the smile that Jim Prescott had invented in his story, real and full and belonging entirely to this moment. "It is absolutely a yes." He kissed her for the first time there, in the barn in December, with the Kansas cold outside and the mare regarding them, both with the equine patience of an animal who has seen everything and judges nothing. And it was not a dramatic kiss in the way of theater. It was simply the kiss of two people who know exactly what they are doing and exactly who they are doing it with. They were married in March of 1883 at the church in Caldwell where Grace had spoken at her father's funeral 4 months before. The service was small because Grace wanted honest over showy, and Roy agreed completely. Edward Prescott stood as a witness. Two of the Rocking H's most loyal hands, a steady older man named Abel and a younger one named Casper, who had been with the ranch through the bad years and had continued under Roy's management with evident relief, stood in the back of the church and tried unsuccessfully to look as though they were not deeply moved. The ceremony was conducted by the Methodist minister, a bearded man named Reverend Groves who had known Edmund Talmadge, and looked at Grace with the particular warmth of a person who has watched someone navigate hard weather and come through it. Grace wore a dress of deep blue wool, her mother's pearls, and her own expression, which was the best thing she had to wear to any occasion. Roy wore his best suit, which he had purchased in Caldwell the week before, and stood at the front of the church with the still, self-possessed bearing that everyone who knew him recognized as his natural register. When Reverend Groves asked him to speak his vows, Roy Mercer spoke them in the measured, direct voice he used for everything he genuinely meant, which was the voice of a man who did not distinguish between the important things and the way he spoke about them. They went back to the Rocking H that same afternoon, because the ranch required tending and spring required attention, and neither of them wanted ceremony to extend beyond its natural duration. But they went back differently than either of them had arrived, which is the most honest definition of what a wedding does. The spring of 1883 was a good one for the ranch, better than the 2 preceding years, and the summer cattle market held at a price that allowed Grace to make a substantial payment against the remaining debt structure and invest in the repair of the south pasture fencing that had been deferred for 3 years. Roy managed the operational side with the quiet efficiency that had become his signature on the property, and Grace managed the financial and business side with the same competence she had brought to every other problem that had presented itself to her. They were not a household that confused partnership with the erasure of individual ability. Each of them was fully capable. Each of them was made more capable by the other. This was not always comfortable, because competence has edges and two people with strong views will sometimes sharpen themselves on each other. But they had established early the habit of honesty and the practice of working through disagreement without damage, and this held. In the evenings, they sat on the porch that had been her father's preferred place at day's end, and they talked, or they did not talk, and both were equally comfortable. It was on one such evening in late summer that Grace told Roy she was pregnant. She told him the way she told him everything, directly, without ceremony, watching his face. Roy's face went through something she had not seen it do before, a rapid and entirely unguarded succession of emotions, starting with astonishment and moving through something warm and enormous, and settling, finally, into the particular quiet joy of a man receiving news that is so good it takes a moment to become real. He reached over and took her hand. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Well," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which was so rare for Roy Mercer that Grace found it rather beautiful. "Well, their son was born in April of 1884, delivered by the doctor from Caldwell in the bedroom of the ranch house while Roy waited in the parlor in a state of controlled anxiety that Abel, who stayed through the night to be useful, later described to Casper as the closest to distress he had ever seen the foreman. They named him Edmund Roy Talmadge Mercer, Edmund for her father, Roy for his own, Talmadge because the name belonged on this land and Mercer because everything else did too. He was a strong, noisy baby who arrived with a full head of dark hair and extremely definite opinions about the schedule of his meals. Grace managed him with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, which did not mean she did not adore him with a completeness that surprised her, because she had not known, before Edmund arrived, that it was possible to feel that kind of immediate and total love for someone so new. Roy held his son for the first time on the morning after the birth, standing in the bedroom in the April light, with the careful, slightly awed expression of a man who understands he is holding something irreplaceable. Grace watched him from the bed, exhausted and clear-eyed, and thought that she would never forget the particular way Roy Mercer looked at their son in that first morning, with the whole weight of who he was turned toward this new person, fully present, fully committed. By the summer of 1884, the Rocking H was operating at its best capacity in years. Roy had negotiated a favorable grazing arrangement with a neighboring property to the east that expanded the summer range. Grace had secured a supply contract with a Wichita beef processor that guaranteed a base price through the following year. The remaining debts were close to elimination. They had hired 2 additional permanent hands and were beginning to think about what the next phase of the ranch's growth might look like. In Caldwell, the stories about Grace Talmadge had not entirely disappeared. Stories like the ones that had been built at the Rocking H Roundup tend to have remarkable staying power. But they had begun to collide with the reality of who Grace actually was. The woman who came into town with the directness of someone who knew exactly what she needed, who conducted business with a clarity that even men who had preferred her as a myth eventually had to respect, who walked beside her husband in the particular way of 2 people who have genuinely chosen each other. On the evening that Roy Mercer walked into the Silver Spur Saloon in Caldwell in August of 1882, the evening that had opened this story, that night was more than 2 years in the past now, but it remained, for Roy, one of the sharper memories of that early time, not because it had been eventful in itself, but because of what it had represented. He had walked into that bar and heard 20 minutes of stories about Grace Talmadge from men who had been in the same place she was and had never seen her at all. He had heard Jim Prescott and Cal Bridges and Tom Vickers and Hank Delaney and half a dozen others build their mythologies from the raw material of their own wanting, shape a woman out of their own needs and call her Grace, decorate her with qualities she did not possess and deny her the qualities she did. And he had said nothing, not from cowardice, but from the simple impossibility of competing with 20 men's inventions using only the truth. The truth was considerably better than the inventions, but truth usually is, and people do not always want to hear it. Later, much later, on an evening in 1885 when he and Grace were sitting on their porch with Edmund toddling in the yard and the prairie light going long and gold across the grass, Roy told her about that night. He told her about walking into the saloon and hearing the stories and the particular quality of the silence he had offered in return. Grace listened to him without speaking for a long time after he finished. "Every man at the Roundup had a story about me," she said. "Yes," Roy said. "Except you." Except me. She was quiet for another moment, watching their son chase a grasshopper with the intense concentration of a toddler who has identified a purpose and is committed to it. "What would you have said if you had answered them?" she asked. Roy considered this. "I would have said that Grace Talmadge was the most capable person at that roundup by a considerable margin, that she rode well, thought clearly, acted when action was required, and that she had a way of looking at the world that was completely free of self-deception, that she was not what any of the stories said she was, because the stories were about the teller and not the subject." He paused. "And that I intended to stay on the rocking H for as long as she would have me." Grace looked at him sideways, and her smile was the real one, the one that had nothing to perform and everything to mean. "That," she said, "would have been a very good story." "Better than theirs," he agreed. Edmund caught the grasshopper, looked at it with the expression of a person who has achieved a goal and is now reconsidering the goal, and released it. The summer rolled on. In September of 1885, Prescott came out to the ranch with the final documentation confirming that the last of Edmund Talmadge Sr.'s estate debts had been satisfied. The rocking H was clear. Every acre, every building, every head of cattle and every piece of fence line was legally and completely Grace Talmadge Mercer's, held without encumbrance, without threat, without the shadow of Vernon Stroud or Aldous Crane or anyone else who had tried to take what was hers. Prescott shook Roy's hand and embraced Grace briefly, with the warmth of a man who had spent several years being useful to people he genuinely respected. "Your father would be proud," he said to Grace. "He would be insufferably pleased with himself, is what he would be," Grace said, and the affectionate exasperation in her voice was so entirely herself that both men smiled. After Prescott left, Grace stood in the yard of the ranch house and looked at the land spreading away in every direction, the good Kansas grass under the September sky, the herd moving quietly in the distance, the buildings that her father had built and that she and Roy had maintained and improved, the whole living fact of the thing that Edmund Talmadge had come out from Ohio to build 40 years before. Roy came and stood beside her. They stood in silence for a while, the good kind, the full kind. "He wanted it to survive him," Grace said. "It has," Roy said, "more than that." She reached over and took his hand, and they stood there in the September light, their son asleep inside the house, their ranch stretching out around them, everything that had been threatened and saved and built and defended standing present and solid in the late afternoon air. And Roy Mercer, who had come to the Rocking H Roundup in the summer of 1882 as a hired hand from Abilene, who had watched 20 men build a mythology around a woman none of them had actually seen, who had had the unusual distinction among his peers of keeping his stories to himself and his eyes clearly open, stood on the ground he had been given the extraordinary good fortune to stand on, and understood that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. There had been a night in the Silver Spur Saloon when every man at the roundup had a story about Grace Talmadge except the one who had been there. The one who had been there had something better than a story. He had the truth of her and the life of her, and the daily extraordinary reality of being loved by someone who had never once confused him with the version of himself that was easier to invent. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. In the distance, the cattle moved through the long grass with the easy confidence of animals on good land, and the sky over the Rocking H went slowly gold and then slowly red and then slowly dark, the way it always did, the way it always would. The following spring brought new calves to the south pasture and new growth along the creek, and the particular renewal that the Kansas prairie manages every year with a thoroughness that still managed to move Roy Mercer the way it had moved him the first time he saw it. He was a man who did not take what was good for granted, which was one of the qualities Grace had identified in him early and which had not diminished in the years since. Edmund, who had turned 2 in April, had developed a personality that was a fascinating and sometimes challenging combination of his mother's directness and his father's deliberateness, applied to the concerns of a 2-year-old with a 2-year-old's urgency. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and his own entirely original expression, which was the particular expression of a person who has decided something and intends to act on it without unnecessary delay. Grace, watching him one morning as he applied this expression to the problem of climbing the fence rail to get a better look at the horses in the corral, said to Roy, "He is going to be completely impossible to manage in about 12 years." "He is impossible to manage now," Roy said with genuine admiration. "He is," she agreed. "He is wonderful." Grace was pregnant again by June, a fact she announced to Roy with the same directness she had the first time, watching his face with those measuring eyes that, as always, caught everything. His face did the same rapid journey it had done before, the same astonishment moving through the same warmth, settling into the same quiet joy. "Another," he said. "Another," she confirmed. He laughed, which was something Roy Mercer did not do lightly or often, a real laugh that surprised him almost as much as it surprised her. "Edmund is going to have opinions about this," he said. "Edmund has opinions about everything," Grace said. "He will manage." Their second child was born in February of 1887, and this time the delivery was slightly faster and considerably louder, and the baby announced herself to the rocking H with a volume that brought Abel and Casper both to the fence outside the house, without either of them being willing to admit why they had suddenly found it necessary to check the fence line at 9 in the evening. They named her Clara, after Grace's mother, who had died when Grace was 11, and of whom Grace had the particular memories of a child who lost a parent before they could fully form, clear in feeling if not in detail. Clara had her father's patience and her grandfather's stubbornness, and a disposition that was, from the first weeks of her life, fundamentally sunny in a way that felt like the arrival of something the ranch had been quietly needing. Edmund was nearly 3 when Clara arrived, and his initial assessment of his sister was scientific. He examined her with the focused seriousness of a person conducting an investigation, and his eventual verdict, delivered to Roy as though it were a formal report, was that she was very small and very loud, and that he approved of her. Roy told Grace this, and Grace said that this was exactly what he would have thought, and the warmth between them in that moment was the warmth of two people who know each other in the way that comes only from years of honest proximity. The rocking H grew. It grew the way things grow when they are properly tended, not explosively, not with drama, but with the steady accumulation of good decisions and honest work and the occasional piece of luck that comes to people who have positioned themselves to receive it. By 1888, the herd had grown to a size that required the leasing of additional grazing land to the east, and the arrangement Roy had negotiated 3 years before had evolved into a formal partnership with the neighboring property that gave both operations advantages they could not have achieved independently. Grace had developed over those years a reputation in Caldwell and in the broader Sumner County cattle community that had nothing to do with the stories from the Silver Spur Saloon. She was known as a sharp businessperson, a fair dealer, a rancher who understood the land and the market with equal facility. Men who had once had myths about her had been replaced in the local economy by men who had contracts with her, and contracts are, in their way, the truest form of reputation. Roy was known as the man who ran the rocking H, which was understood in the county to mean the man who kept the operational side of a well-run operation running well. People who knew them both understood that the rocking H was managed by both of them in the true sense, that the lines of responsibility and authority flowed between them with a practical flexibility that suited what each of them did best, and that the result was something considerably stronger than either of them would have been alone. They were not a household without difficulty. There were hard years, because ranching in the 1880s did not offer anyone the luxury of a run of easy ones. There was a dry summer in 1886 that cost them a significant portion of the summer range and required decisions about the herd that were financially painful in the short term and necessary in the long term. And making those decisions together, required the kind of honesty that is easy in principle and hard in practice. There was a dispute with a neighboring property over the eastern fence line that took 2 years, and Prescott's considerable legal skill to resolve. There was the winter of 1888 to 1889 that was brutal enough to push several smaller operations in the county to the edge of survival, and tested the rocking H in ways that left Roy and Grace both exhausted and temporarily certain they were never going to be warm again. But they had built something that could hold under pressure, because they had built it honestly, from what was actually true rather than what was convenient, from the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had never once let herself be defined by other people's stories, and the steady, faithful attention of a man who had chosen truth over mythology from the very beginning. On a fall evening in 1889, Roy and Grace sat on the porch with Edmund, who was 5, and had recently become capable of staying awake past dark without becoming incoherent, and Clara, who was 2 and had fallen asleep against Roy's arm with the boneless completeness of a small child in total trust, and they watched the October stars come out over the Kansas prairie one by one. Edmund, who had been examining the concept of stars with his characteristic methodical intensity, asked his father why the stars did not fall. Roy thought about this for a moment with the seriousness he always brought to Edmund's questions, because Edmund always deserved the seriousness, and because he was the kind of father who did not give his children less than his best. "They are very far away," Roy said, "so far that they look small, but they are much larger than the sun. The distance holds them where they are." Edmund considered this. "Like the fence holds the cattle." "Something like that," Roy said, and Grace made a sound beside him that was partly amusement and partly something more private. "What?" Roy asked. "Nothing," she said. "Only that he is exactly you when he thinks about things." Roy looked at his son, who was still studying the sky with his mother's gray eyes and his father's deliberate attention, and felt the particular quality of gratitude that comes when you understand that the life you are living is the one you would have chosen even with full knowledge of what it would require. The stars held their places. The prairie breathed in the dark. Clara slept against his arm with her small, absolute trust. Grace reached over in the dark and found his hand. He held it. They had not needed a myth to find each other, and they had not needed one to keep what they had built. They had needed only what they had both brought to that Kansas barn in the summer of 1882, the willingness to look clearly, to speak truthfully, and to stay. The rest had followed from that, as the rest always does when the beginning is honest enough. In Caldwell, at the Silver Spur Saloon, men still told stories. That was what men did in saloons, and the nature of the stories changed over the years with the fashions of telling, but the habit of them did not. There were new stories now about new women, new mythologies being built from glimpses and assumptions, and the particular needs of men who had not yet learned to see. But Grace Talmadge Mercer was no longer the subject of any story she had not told herself. She had the better kind. She had the kind that was lived, the kind that was real, the kind that had her father's name on the deed and her children's voices in the yard and her husband's hand in the dark on the porch in the fall. The kind that asked nothing more of the world than the land and the work and the truth of it, and received in return everything. And Roy Mercer, the quiet man from the Abilene Trail who had walked into the rocking H Roundup one August morning in 1882 with a hired hand's wages and an uncommon willingness to see things as they were, had built from that single decision of honest attention a life so complete and so right that, when he thought about it on those October evenings in those long Kansas silences, he was not sure he had the language for what it was. Only that it was real. Only that it was his. Only that it was everything. The cattle moved through the dark pasture with the patience of animals that have been well tended. The house behind them held its warmth against the fall air. The stars stayed where they were. And the man who had been there, the one man who had seen Grace Talmadge clearly from the beginning, held the hand of the woman who had seen him just as clearly, and they sat together in the good silence of a life that had been earned and chosen and built and kept, all the way to the end of the day, and all the days after.